Why did Donald Trump's biggest piece of leverage over Canada just quietly fall apart? In one sentence, because the oil he threatened to tax is the same oil keeping American gas prices from spiraling out of control. And Canada just finished building a way to sell that oil somewhere else if Washington keeps pushing. Stay with me because by the end of this video, you will understand exactly how a tariff letter meant to punish Canada may end up punishing the country that sent it. Let's start with the moment that set this whole chain of events in motion. In July, Trump sent a letter straight to Prime Minister Mark Carney, posted for the world to see on Truth Social. 35%. That was the new number, replacing the 25% rate that had already been squeezing Canadian industry for months. The letter blamed fentanyl, blamed the trade deficit, blamed what Trump called unfair tariff and non-tariff barriers, and it warned that if Canada retaliated again, the number would climb even higher. The deadline, August 1st. This did not come out of nowhere. For most of this year, Washington and Ottawa had been circling each other, trading threats and small concessions, trying to find some kind of stable footing. Just weeks earlier, Canada had rescinded a digital services tax that Trump called an attack on American tech companies. The two leaders even spoke by phone afterward and agreed to work toward a deal by July 21st. For a moment, it looked like the relationship might actually stabilize. Then the letter arrived, and any sense of progress evaporated overnight. This was not even the first time oil and energy had been dragged into this fight, either. Earlier this year, Trump threatened a full 100% tariff on Canadian goods if Ottawa moved forward with a trade deal involving China, warning that he would not let Canada become what he called a drop-off port for Chinese products headed into the United States. Around the same time, he threatened to delay the opening of the new Gordie Howe International Bridge, a bridge Canada built and paid for almost entirely on its own. Each time, the message was the same: fall in line or pay a price. On the surface, this looked like classic Trump leverage. Corner an ally, threaten their economy, force concessions. It had worked before, or at least it looked like it had worked before. But something was different this time, and almost nobody in Washington seemed to notice it in the moment. Here's the number that changes everything. Canada supplied a record 60.88% of all oil imported into the United States last year, not 40%, not 50%. 61% of every barrel of foreign oil entering American refineries came from one country, and that country was the one just hit with a 35% tariff threat. $85 billion worth of crude flowing south, keeping refineries running from the Gulf Coast to the Midwest. And the timing could not be worse for anyone hoping to play hardball with that supply, because right now, the Strait of Hormuz is a live wire. Conflict in the region has already squeezed global oil flow once this year, and analysts are warning it could happen again. In a world where the most important choke point for Middle Eastern oil is sitting under a cloud of uncertainty, the last thing any American administration wants to do is destabilize its most reliable, most geographically convenient, most politically friendly source of crude. And yet that is exactly what a 35% tariff threatens to do. Think about how unusual this situation actually is in the history of American energy policy. For decades, the entire strategic goal of Washington was to reduce dependence on any single foreign source of oil, to avoid exactly the kind of vulnerability that came with relying on the Middle East during the embargo years of the 1970s. And now, without much public discussion, the United States has ended up more dependent on a single foreign supplier than at almost any point in modern history, except this time the supplier sits right across a land border instead of an ocean away. That dependence was supposed to be the safe kind. Friendly neighbor, shared language, decades of integrated infrastructure. A tariff war turns that safe dependence into a live question mark right at the moment global supply is already nervous. Think about what oil actually does in this relationship. It is not like aluminum, where a tariff mostly just shifts profit margins around. Oil touches everything. It touches the price at the pump in Ohio. It touches airline ticket prices. It touches how much it costs to ship a package across the country. When you tax the source of 61% of your imported oil, you are not just taxing Canada. You are taxing every American who drives to work, every small business that runs a delivery van, every retiree living on a fixed income who still needs to fill up the tank. Now, here is where the story gets interesting because Canada did not just sit back and hope Washington would show mercy. We have actually seen a preview of exactly this dynamic already, and it happened with aluminum, not oil. When Washington pushed tariffs on Canadian aluminum as high as 50%, most people assumed Canadian producers would simply eat the cost or shut down capacity. Instead, they redirected shipments to Europe, where prices were climbing and demand was wide open. European buyers, hungry for supply, started paying record prices for Canadian aluminum, and Canadian producers walked away with better margins than they had selling into a tariff-protected American market. The tariff did not punish Canada. It pushed Canada toward a better customer. Oil is a much bigger, much slower moving market than aluminum, but the underlying lesson is identical. When you tax a supplier that has other options, you are not squeezing them, you are pushing them out the door. 3 months into this trade war, something changed in Alberta. A pipeline that had been debated for years finally moved from paper to steel. In early July, Prime Minister Carney stood alongside Alberta Premier Danielle Smith and announced an investment agreement to build a new pipeline from Bruderheim, northeast of Edmonton, all the way to the British Columbia coast. The plan: more than 1 million barrels a day, moving west instead of south, loaded onto tankers bound for Asian markets instead of American refineries. This is not a small gesture. This is a structural shift in where Canadian oil goes. For decades, the pipeline map of North America pointed almost entirely south into the United States, because that was the only market Canadian crude could reach at scale. Every barrel Canada produced beyond its own needs had exactly one customer, and that customer knew it, and that customer priced accordingly. Canadian oil sold at a discount, sometimes a steep discount, because there was nowhere else for it to go. That started changing in 2024 when the Trans Mountain expansion finally opened, giving Canadian crude its first real path to the Pacific. The results showed up almost immediately. Canada began shipping a record share of its oil to countries other than the United States. In November alone, 14.1% of Canadian crude went to the rest of the world, with China taking 10% of the total on its own. Compare that to 2023, when non-American exports averaged just 3%. That is not a gradual drift. That is a door swinging open. Now, let's be honest about the numbers, because this channel does not deal in exaggeration. The pivot to Asia has not replaced the American market. From January through November of last year, Canadian oil exports to the United States fell by $13.3 billion, while exports to non-American buyers grew by about $7.2 billion. That is real growth, but it is not a full offset. 90% of Canadian crude exports still went to the United States even after the Trans Mountain expansion came online. But here is why that gap matters less than it looks like on paper. Leverage is not about total volume. Leverage is about what happens at the margin, when a buyer starts using threats instead of contracts. The United States does not need to lose 61% of its Canadian oil supply to feel real pain. It only needs to lose enough that refineries start scrambling, that spot prices start climbing, that the White House starts fielding angry calls from gas station owners in swing states. A shift of just a few percentage points, multiplied across $85 billion in trade, is enough to rattle a market that has spent decades assuming Canadian oil would always be there, always cheap, always flowing. And that discount, that is the other half of the story, because for years, Canada was forced to sell at a lower price, specifically because the United States was the only buyer with pipeline access, landlocked oil, sitting in Alberta, with nowhere to go except south, meant American refiners could name their price, and Canadian producers had no real alternative but to accept it. Economists have a simple name for that kind of arrangement: a captive market. And captive markets almost always end the same way, with the captive side eventually finding a way out, even if it takes years to build. Now, with a West Coast pipeline actually funded and under construction, Canada has something it never really had before: pricing power. Carney himself has said publicly that the new pipeline can reduce the price discount on Canadian oil sold into American markets because American refiners now know there is an alternative buyer waiting on the other side of the mountains. That is not a threat. That is basic economics. When you have one customer, that customer sets the price. When you have two, the conversation changes, and it changes permanently, not just for the length of one trade dispute. This is the part that gets lost in the day-to-day headlines about tariff letters and deadlines. A tariff is a temporary tool. A pipeline is not. Once that infrastructure exists, once tankers are loading at the British Columbia coast bound for Asian refineries, that capacity does not disappear the moment a new trade deal gets signed. It becomes a permanent fact of the market, a permanent second option sitting there for as long as Alberta keeps producing oil. Trump can win this particular fight over the next few months and still lose the larger argument about who has leverage over whom for the next 20 years. Carney has not been quiet about any of this either. Speaking at the Economic Club of New York, he told American business leaders directly that Canada wants closer cooperation on aluminum, on auto manufacturing, on critical minerals, framing Canadian resources as something that strengthens the American economy rather than threatens it. His phrase was simple and pointed: "Canada strong will help make America great again." It was a message aimed less at winning a public relations battle and more at reminding Washington quietly and repeatedly that Canada is not an adversary to be squeezed. It is a supplier with leverage of its own if pushed too far. So picture the position Washington finds itself in: a tariff letter demanding concessions aimed at a supplier that provides 61% of your imported oil during a period when Middle Eastern supply is already under strain, against a country that just spent 3 months proving it has a second customer lined up and paying more competitive prices. That is not the position of maximum leverage. That is the position of a poker player who just realized the other side has quietly built a second table to play at. Let's talk about what happens next, because there are 3 ways this plays out, and each one tells you something different about where this trade war is heading. The first scenario: Washington quietly carves out energy. This is the most likely outcome if cooler heads in the administration start looking closely at gas price data. Oil already has some protection under existing trade agreements, since qualifying crude can be exempt from certain tariffs, and the pressure to expand those exemptions will only grow if pump prices start climbing before the midterms. In this scenario, Trump keeps his tough talk on lumber, on aluminum, on dairy, but quietly makes sure crude oil stays untouched. because no administration wants to be blamed for $4 gasoline heading into an election year. The second scenario, Trump holds firm and Canada accelerates the pivot. If the 35% tariff actually takes effect on oil products come August, expect Ottawa to lean even harder into the West Coast pipeline timeline, into new agreements with Asian buyers, into diversification away from a market that just proved it could turn hostile overnight. This is the scenario energy ministers in Alberta have been quietly preparing for, and it is the one that permanently changes the shape of North American energy trade, even after this particular fight ends. In this scenario, watch what happens to American refiners along the Gulf Coast and the Midwest, the ones built specifically to process the heavier grade of crude that Canada produces. Those refineries cannot simply swap in a different type of oil overnight. Retooling that kind of infrastructure takes years and enormous capital. So even a modest reduction in Canadian supply, driven by exporters chasing better prices overseas instead of a discounted American market, could tighten domestic supply enough to show up directly in the price at the pump. That is the scenario Washington fears most, and it is the one that gets less attention than it deserves because it does not require Canada to cut off the United States entirely. It only requires Canada to have somewhere else to sell and simply choose the better price. The third scenario, and the one most people are not talking about enough, a partial squeeze, where Washington raises tariffs on nearly everything except the products that would immediately hurt American consumers. Steel, aluminum, dairy, lumber, all fair game for maximum pressure. But energy stays protected, quietly, without an announcement, without Trump ever admitting that Canada has any leverage at all. This is the version where both sides get to claim victory in public while the actual trade flows barely change beneath the surface. This kind of quiet carve-out has already happened once in this trade war, and it is worth remembering. Existing trade rules already exempt goods that qualify under the broader Continental Trade Agreement, and a large share of Canada-American trade, including a meaningful portion of energy, already moves under some form of protection, even during the most heated moments of this dispute. The pattern in Washington has consistently been loud threats, followed by quiet exceptions once the economic consequences start to show up in polling numbers. There is no reason to expect oil would be treated any differently, especially with an election cycle approaching and gas prices sitting exactly where voters notice them most. Whichever path this takes, one thing is already clear. And it is the thing most coverage of this trade war keeps missing. Tariffs work best against suppliers who have no alternative buyer and no alternative route to market. Canada spent 3 years fixing exactly that problem. The Trans Mountain expansion, the West Coast pipeline agreement, the growing relationship with Asian buyers, none of that happened by accident. It happened because Ottawa watched 4 years of unpredictable American trade policy and decided that having one customer, no matter how large, was a national vulnerability. There is also a political dimension to this that rarely gets mentioned in the trade coverage. Alberta has been the loudest voice in Canada pushing for exactly this kind of diversification, partly out of frustration with years of pipeline delays under the previous government, and partly because separatist sentiment in the province has been simmering for years, fueled by the feeling that Ottawa left Alberta's energy industry stranded with no way to reach global markets. The West Coast pipeline deal did more than open a new trade route. It gave the federal government in Ottawa something concrete to point to, proof that Alberta's oil has a future beyond one customer, at a moment when keeping the province politically satisfied matters more than usual. In other words, this pipeline is not just a response to Trump. It is also a response to pressure from inside Canada itself. and that makes the project far more durable than a simple reaction to one tariff letter. Here's my honest read on where this goes. I think Trump backs off oil specifically while keeping the pressure on everything else. Not because he wants to, but because the math does not work any other way. You cannot credibly run for re-election on a strong economy while your own tariff policy is pushing gas prices higher in every swing state that matters. Energy is the one lever that hurts the person pulling it just as much as the person on the other end. But I also think this moment marks something bigger than one trade dispute. It marks the end of the assumption that Canada has nowhere else to sell its oil. That assumption shaped 50 years of energy trade between these two countries. And once an assumption like that breaks, it does not come back, no matter how this particular fight resolves. Every future American president who wants to use tariffs as a weapon against Canada now has to reckon with a fact that did not exist 5 years ago. Canada has a door to the Pacific. That single change quietly rewrites the rules of every future negotiation, whether the headline that week is about oil, lumber, aluminum, or something nobody has thought to threaten yet. So here is the question I want you to sit with. If Canada finishes proving it can sell its oil somewhere other than the United States, does America lose more from this trade war than it ever gains? Drop your answer in the comments and tell me which of the 3 scenarios you think actually plays out by the end of the year. If this kind of analysis is useful to you, hit subscribe because we track these shifts as they happen, not months after they are already old news. And if you want to understand exactly how we got here, go back and watch our video on Carney's West Coast pipeline deal, because that agreement is the hinge this entire story turns on. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.